The galaxy is about 13 billion years old, and it holds a few 100 billion stars. A single civilization, expanding outward at even 1/100th of the speed of light, building machines that build more machines, could spread from one end of it to the other in a few million years. A few million years against 13 billion. That is the last blink before the end of a long film. Which means the galaxy has had time to be settled, end to end, not once but 1,000 times over. It should be full. It should be loud. And yet when we turn our instruments on 100,000 nearby galaxies and look for the heat of a civilization burning through its stars, we find nothing. When we listen across the whole radio sky for a single deliberate signal, we hear nothing. The places that should be crowded are empty. And the most honest question to ask about that emptiness is not where is everyone, it is what happened to them and whether it is waiting to happen to us. Tonight, we are going to take the most disturbing answer to that silence seriously, the one called the Great Filter, and follow its logic all the way down. By the end of this, you will understand why the silence is evidence and not just absence, why something must be stopping civilizations before they spread, and why the more life we ever find out there, the worse our own odds become. I am not going to tell you we are safe. The honest version of this runs exactly opposite to what most people feel when they hope to find life. We have always hoped we are not alone. This is the argument that being alone might be the only good news left. If you like following an argument all the way to the hard place it actually leads, a quick like or subscribe helps these videos reach the people who would too. Now, let us begin. Start with the size of the thing, because the size is what makes the silence strange. Our galaxy is about 13 billion years old, a slow-turning wheel of a few 100 billion stars, and most of those stars are older than the Sun. Around a great many of them are planets, because we now know that planets are the ordinary outcome of a star forming, not the rare one. So the stage has been set, with billions of worlds, for almost the entire history of the universe. Whatever is going to happen out there has had an immense amount of time to happen. Now put a civilization on one of those worlds and let it do the simplest expansive thing. It does not need faster than light travel or any physics we do not have. It needs only patience and machines. A craft crosses to the nearest stars over centuries, slow and cold, and when it arrives it does not need a crew to greet it, only the ability to find raw material. A single asteroid will do, and to build copies of itself. Those copies cross to the next stars and do the same. The number of probes does not add, it doubles. And a number that doubles again and again climbs past every barrier you can name in almost no time at all. When you work the arithmetic, the answer is hard to accept the first time you see it. A wave of self-replicating machines, moving at even 1/100th of the speed of light, sweeps across the entire galaxy in a few million years. Some careful estimates put it lower, at a few 100,000 years for the leading edge to cross. Set that against the age of the galaxy. A few million years against 13 billion is the last breath of a long story, the final frame of a film that has been running all afternoon. The galaxy has had time for that wave to cross it not once, but hundreds of times over, started by hundreds of separate worlds. So here is the first fact, stated plainly. The galaxy should be full. Not full of radio chatter aimed politely at us, but full of presence, of machines and works, and the slow rearrangement of matter that any long-lived expanding civilization would leave behind. A full galaxy would be obvious. It would be the kind of thing you could not look at without seeing. And our own solar system, this ordinary system around an ordinary star, has sat here in an arm of that galaxy for 4.5 billion years, with the welcome mat out the entire time, and nothing has ever arrived. No probe, no signal we can confirm, no trace of anyone having passed through. The man whose name is attached to this, an Italian physicist over lunch, is supposed to have asked it as a simple question, where is everybody? And the question has never been answered. People sometimes treat it as a riddle, a clever puzzle to turn over for fun, I want to be clear that it is not a riddle. It is an observation. The expectation and the evidence point in opposite directions hard, and the gap between them is the thing we have to explain. The emptiness is not the absence of data. The emptiness is the data. I should be honest about what this first argument assumes, because honesty is the only way this stays worth your time. It assumes that absence of evidence is meaningful, when absence can also just mean we have not looked well enough. And it assumes that expanding outward is something advanced life tends to do, when maybe it is not. Maybe the urge to spread burns out or never lights. Hold both of those objections. We are going to test them, not wave them away. But even granting them their due, the basic shape stands. A galaxy this old and this large, with this much time, should show something, and it does not. It helps to feel the time scale in your own body, rather than as a row of zeros. Set the age of the galaxy across a single year, from a new year to the next. On that scale, the entire span a fast-moving probe wave would need to cross the galaxy, a few million years, is something like a couple of hours on the final evening of December. The galaxy has had the whole year. The crossing takes part of one night at the end. There is no version of the arithmetic where there was not enough time. Time is the one thing the universe has handed out in unimaginable surplus, and the silence is what it did with all of it. And it is worth saying that the wave would not even need a guiding hand. But once the first self-replicating machine works, the process runs on its own, the way a fire does not need to be told to spread to the next tree. Each new system mined, each new copy launched, happens without any central command, without anyone back home deciding anything. A civilization could spark such a wave and then vanish entirely, and the wave would keep going, crossing the galaxy long after its makers were dust. So the silence is not only the absence of living civilizations, it is the absence of their leftovers, their automated descendants, the things that should still be spreading whether or not anyone is left to mine them. Consider how young our own star is against that backdrop, because it sharpens the strangeness. The Sun is about 4.5 billion years old, but the galaxy is roughly 3 times older, which means stars and worlds were forming and cooling and warming for billions of years before the Earth existed at all. If life and intelligence are anything other than freakishly rare, then somewhere out there a civilization had a head start, measured not in centuries but in billions of years. A civilization with that kind of lead would not be a little ahead of us. It would have had time to do everything, to spread everywhere, to reshape whatever it wished, long before our planet had cooled. And still, when our world finally woke up and looked around, it found an empty sky. And the wait is the part that is easy to skip past, so let me hold it still for a moment. Our solar system formed, the planets settled into their orbits, the Earth cooled and grew oceans and life and eventually us, and across that entire 4.5 billion year stretch the door stood open. At any point in all that time, a probe, a signal, a passing machine from elsewhere could have arrived, and the geological and chemical record we can read shows no sign that one ever did. It is not that we glanced up recently and saw nothing. It is that nothing came for the whole long age of the Earth, through every era, while the planet did the slow work of producing something that could eventually wonder why. There is a name for this that I find more honest than paradox, and it is the Great Silence. A paradox sounds like a logic puzzle with a trick answer waiting to be found. A silence is just a thing that is true, a quiet where there should be sound, and it carries no promise of a clever resolution. The Great Silence is the plain condition of the sky as we have measured it, and the various theories we are walking through are not solutions to a riddle so much as guesses about what a real and total quiet might mean. I prefer the harder word because it keeps us honest about the fact that we are not solving anything yet. We are standing in the quiet, trying to understand it. Hold one more time onto what the doubling really means, because the mind resists it, and the resistance is the whole point. We are used to growth that is slow and linear, a frontier that creeps. This is not that. A process that doubles turns a handful into a multitude, and a multitude into a saturation in a small number of steps, and applied to star systems, it means that the gap between a civilization that has barely left its world and one that has filled the galaxy is on the clock of the galaxy, almost no gap at all. There is no long, visible, halfway stage stretched comfortably across the eons. There is a sudden filling, brief and total, and then a galaxy that is occupied. We see no occupied galaxy. We see no filling in progress. We see the quiet that should not be there. We tend to assume, without quite saying it, that we are ordinary, that whatever happened here happens routinely, that the universe is the sort of place that makes worlds like ours as a matter of course. It is a reasonable starting guess, and it has served science well, the steady lesson that we are not the center of anything. But the silence pushes back against that assumption in an uncomfortable way. If we really are ordinary, then the galaxy should be full of the ordinary outcome, and it is not. So either the assumption is wrong and we are stranger than we think, or the assumption is right and something is reliably erasing the ordinary outcome before it can be seen. Neither of those is comfortable, and the silence forces us to choose between being a fluke and being in danger. Think about what filled the long wait on Earth, because it shows how much can happen on one world while the sky stays empty. For most of the planet's history, life was nothing but single cells in the water. For billions of years, no plants, no animals, no minds. Then complex cells, then the first many-celled creatures, then the slow crowding of the seas and the greening of the land, the rise and fall of whole kingdoms of living things, mass extinctions that erased most of what lived and were followed by new flourishings. All of that, the entire pageant of life on Earth, unfolded under a sky from which nothing ever came. The galaxy had every one of those long ages to send us a visitor, and across all of them it sent nothing. Consider our own solar system as a place that should hold evidence and does not. If even a single civilization had passed through this region in the billions of years our system has existed, sending the kind of self-perpetuating machines the argument describes, then some trace of that visit might linger. A probe gone quiet in a stable orbit, a worked asteroid, anything that does not occur by nature. We have mapped our neighborhood in growing detail, the planets and their moons, the belts of rock and ice, and we have found exactly the natural objects we would expect and nothing that anyone built. Our own small corner, the one place we can examine closely, is as untouched as the rest of the sky is quiet. The deeper point under all of this is that time, not space, is what makes the silence strange. The distances between stars are large, but a civilization with patience and self-building machines does not need to cross them quickly. It needs only to keep going, and the galaxy has handed out time in quantities that dwarf the patience any expansion would require. Billions of years is enough for a slow wave to cross the galaxy 1,000 times. So the usual comfort that space is simply too big and the stars too far does not actually rescue us. The stars are far, but they are not far enough to matter against the ages available, and the silence is what remains once that comfort is taken away. The silence is the first fact, and it is louder than it looks. But maybe the trouble is simply that we would not notice them, that a civilization could be out there and stay invisible to instruments as crude as ours. So before we conclude anything from the quiet, we have to ask what a galaxy full of life would actually look like, and whether we have honestly looked. A civilization that keeps growing runs into one hard requirement, and the requirement is energy. Everything it might want to do, think, build, expand, costs energy, and the energy in any system is mostly locked up in its star. A planet intercepts only a sliver of the light its star pours out. Almost all of that light streams past into the dark and is lost. So a civilization that needed more and kept needing more would eventually stop letting that light escape. It would build to capture it, structures or swarms of them spread around the star, drinking the light before it could leave. The thing about captured energy is that it does not vanish. You use it, and when you are done it leaves as heat, at a longer and cooler wavelength, in the infrared. So a star wrapped in collectors would dim invisible light and brighten in the infrared, glowing with the leftover warmth of everything its civilization had done. Scale that up to a civilization that had spread across a whole galaxy and harnessed many of its stars, and the galaxy itself would shine wrong. It would be too dark where it should be bright, and too bright in the heat where it should be faint. That is a specific, measurable signature, and it does not require anyone to be sending us a message. It is just the waste heat of industry radiating into the night. So we looked. Using an infrared survey of the whole sky, one team examined about 100,000 nearby galaxies, each one a wheel of hundreds of billions of stars, and checked every one for that telltale excess of mid-infrared heat, the glow of a civilization burning through its stars on a galactic scale. Out of 100,000 galaxies, the number found to be widely lit that way was 0. A small handful showed slightly more infrared than expected, around 50 of them, and every one of those can be explained by ordinary processes, dust and young stars, and the natural churn of a galaxy. None of them was reprocessing the bulk of its starlight. 100,000 chances, and 100,000 times nothing. Closer to home, others searched our own galaxy for single stars wrapped in collectors, going star by star through whole sky catalogues of infrared sources. The candidates that turned up, every promising one, resolved on closer inspection into something natural, an aging star shedding dust, a cloud of gas, a glowing region where stars are born. Interesting objects, all of them, but none of them built. And alongside the search for heat, there has been the older search, the one most people picture when they think of this. The listening. For more than 60 years we have pointed radio telescopes at the sky and listened for a signal that carries the mark of intent, a narrow tone, a pattern, anything that nature does not make on its own. The effort runs to this day, with dedicated programs sweeping the nearest stars across billions of channels. In all that time, the confirmed count of deliberate signals from another civilization is 0. There was one famous moment, a strong, narrow burst caught by a radio telescope in 1977, so striking that the astronomer who found it wrote a single word of astonishment beside the printout. It never came again. Decades of looking back at that same patch of sky have turned up nothing, and it remains unexplained rather than confirmed, a single point that never repeated. I want to be fair about the limits here, because this is where it would be easy to oversell. We have examined a tiny slice of the places and ways a civilization could exist. A culture might never build the things we looked for. It might use energy so efficiently that it leaves almost no heat. It might be quiet on purpose, which is its own dark possibility we will come to. A galaxy-spanning civilization, harnessing most of its stars, is an extreme to expect, and not finding that extreme does not rule out everything quieter. All true. But notice what the looking has established anyway. There is a tidy objection that people reach for here, and it deserves an answer rather than a dismissal. Maybe the objection goes, advanced civilizations stop expanding. Maybe they turn inward satisfied and never bother to fill the galaxy at all. It is possible, but notice how much that objection has to carry. It has to be true not of some civilizations, but of essentially all of them. Every culture on every world across billions of years, without a single exception choosing to spread, because one exception is all it takes to fill the sky. A rule that admits of no exceptions across that many independent cases is itself a kind of filter, and a strange and powerful one. The same goes for the gentler idea that they are simply using technologies we cannot detect, communicating in ways too subtle for our instruments, perhaps. But the heat we searched for is not a message, and it is not subtle. It is the unavoidable physical consequence of using energy, as fixed as the warmth coming off your own skin. A civilization can choose not to broadcast. It is much harder for it to choose not to radiate the waste heat of everything it does, and a galaxy of such civilizations should glow with it. We looked for that glow across 100,000 galaxies, and the galaxies looked back at us with nothing but the ordinary light of their stars. It is worth naming the scale that organizes all of this. because it makes the searches make sense. A civilization can be sorted roughly by how much energy it commands. One that masters the resources of its home planet is at the first rung. One that captures the full output of its star is at the second. One that draws on the energy of an entire galaxy is at the third. The infrared search was aimed squarely at that third kind, the galaxy-spanning civilization, because that is the loudest thing the argument predicts, and the easiest to see across enormous distances. We looked for the brightest signature on the whole list, the one hardest to hide, and across 100,000 galaxies we did not find it once. The honesty this section most needs is about how little of the search space we have actually covered, and it is genuinely very little. If you picture all the directions, distances, frequencies and times a signal could come from as an immense volume, the portion we have examined with real sensitivity is closer to a single cup drawn from an ocean than to anything you could call thorough. So the nulls do not prove the sky is empty of signals. What they do is rule out the loudest, most obvious occupants, the galaxy harnessing civilizations whose heat we could not have missed. And even that limited result is heavy, because the argument predicted those loud occupants should be common, and they are simply not where we can see them. Beyond heat and radio, there is a third way we have tried to listen, by watching for light rather than radio waves, brief and powerful pulses of laser that a civilization might use to signal or to push craft between the stars. The advantage is that a tight beam of light can outshine a star for the instant it flashes, a hard thing to mistake for nature. We have watched for those flashes too, across many stars, and the result has been the same as everywhere else, which is nothing confirmed. Each new method we invent gives the silence another chance to break, another channel through which a signal could finally reach us, and so far each channel has carried the same quiet as the last. And here is the part that turns the search back on us, which I think is the most sobering thing about it. If a civilization like ours kept growing, kept harnessing more energy, kept spreading, then in time it would become exactly the loud, infrared, bright, galaxy-altering presence we went looking for and did not find. We are, put plainly, a young version of the very thing whose absence we are trying to explain. So when we scan 100,000 galaxies and find none of them lit that way, we are not only learning about strangers, we are looking at 100,000 futures that our own kind of civilization could have grown into, and seeing that none of them did, or that none that did survive to shine. About 50 of the 100,000 galaxies in that survey did show a little more infrared than a clean, ordinary galaxy would, and it is worth being clear about why none of them counted as a discovery. A galaxy can run hot in the infrared for entirely natural reasons. Thick clouds of dust warmed by young stars, a burst of star formation, the glow of gas falling toward a central black hole. Every one of the slightly anomalous galaxies fit comfortably inside those natural explanations, with no need to invoke anything built. That is the honest result, not a hint of civilizations carefully hedged, but a clean null with a handful of ordinary objects that looked briefly interesting and then resolved into nature on a closer look. The dedicated modern search for signals is not a small or casual effort, which is part of what makes the silence way. A major program launched about a decade ago put $100 million toward listening, with time on the largest radio telescopes sweeping the nearest million stars and the plane of our own galaxy, and a sample of other galaxies besides, across billions of channels at once. It is the most thorough listening campaign ever mounted, by a wide margin, and it has been running for years. It has found candidates worth a second look, as any sensitive search will, and every one so far has turned out to be interference from our own technology or ordinary noise. The most determined listening we have ever done has returned the same quiet as the rest. The search closer to home, for a single star wrapped in collectors, rather than a whole galaxy, ran into a stubborn kind of imposter. A star shrouded in dust glows warmly in the infrared in much the same way a captured star might. And the night is full of aging stars shedding their outer layers into clouds that catch and re-emit their light. When the whole sky was combed for the warm signature of a captured star, the candidates that surfaced turned out, one after another, to be these natural objects, dusty old stars and clouds of gas, interesting in their own right and built by no one. The result placed a ceiling on how many such captured stars could be hiding nearby, and the ceiling came down close to zero. Step back and weigh what the searchers together have actually established. Because it is narrow but solid, we have not proven the galaxy empty, and we could not, with the slice of it we have examined. What we have done is rule out the loudest possibility, the one the argument most strongly predicted. The civilization that grows so large it cannot help but be seen across the gulfs between galaxies. That prediction was clean, and the result was clean. The brightest occupants the theory imagined are not in the 100,000 galaxies we checked, and they are not among the nearer stars we combed, and that absence is the hard floor on which everything else in this subject has to stand. The silence is not for lack of looking, and it is not for lack of expecting something loud. We checked the brightest, most obvious thing a great civilization would do, the harnessing of stars on a scale that shines across intergalactic distances, and found it nowhere across 100,000 galaxies. So set the looking aside for a moment and ask the question underneath it. If the galaxy should be full, and the loudest version of full is simply not there, how many civilizations should we have expected in the first place, and what would have to be true for the honest number to be essentially none? There is a way to take the impossible question, how many civilizations are out there, and break it into smaller questions you can at least reason about. You start with the number of stars, then ask what fraction have planets, then what fraction of those planets could support life, then how often life actually starts, how often it becomes complex, how often complex life becomes intelligent, how often intelligence builds a technological civilization, and how long such a civilization lasts once it does. Multiply that chain of fractions together, and you get an estimate of how many detectable civilizations should be sharing the galaxy with us right now. This chain was first written down by an astronomer arranging the terms of the problem, and for a long time most of the early fractions were pure guesswork. They are not anymore. We used to wonder whether planets were common or whether our solar system was a fluke. We now know. Planets outnumber stars. Almost every star you see has a system around it, and a real fraction of those systems have a world at the right distance for liquid water, neither scorched nor frozen. The count of potentially habitable worlds in this one galaxy runs into the billions. The front of the chain, the part we can actually measure, came back generous. That generosity is exactly what sharpens the problem. If the early fractions are large, planets common, suitable worlds common, then for the whole product to come out at essentially zero detectable civilizations, something later in the chain has to be brutally, punishingly small. The math leaves no escape. Either life almost never starts, even on a suitable world, or life starts but almost never climbs to complexity, or it reaches complexity but almost never becomes intelligent and technological, or civilizations arise but almost never last long enough to be seen. One of those steps, at least, has to be a number so close to zero that it cancels out the billions of chances in front of it. This is the moment the silence stops being a curiosity and starts being a verdict about us, because we are somewhere in that chain. We are the one example we have of the whole sequence running to completion. Life that started, grew complex, grew intelligent, built technology, and began to look outward. So the question of which fraction is tiny is not abstract. It is a question about which steps we have already passed and which one might still be waiting, holding a number near zero. For everyone, including us, I have to state the obvious weakness plainly, because the chain is only as good as the numbers you feed it. The later terms, the odds that life arises, that it grows complex, that intelligence appears, that a civilization endures, are still almost entirely unknown. We have one data point for the whole sequence, ourselves, and you cannot build a reliable statistics out of a single case. The chain does not resolve our ignorance. Mostly it organizes it, lays it out in order so you can see exactly where the unknowns sit. That is worth something. But it is not knowledge, and I will not pretend it is. To feel how strange that forced conclusion is, hold the front of the chain in your mind for a moment longer. There are more potentially habitable worlds in this single galaxy than there are people who have ever lived on Earth. Each one has had, in many cases, billions of years of warmth and liquid water and a steady star. Each is a separate experiment in whether a world can wake up, and the result of all those experiments, as far as the sky shows us, is a single example that we know of ourselves and silence everywhere else. That is the contrast the chain forces you to confront. Generosity at the start, emptiness at the end, and a brutal number hidden somewhere in between. I find it clarifying to say what the chain is not. It is not a prediction, and it never gave reliable answers. Feed it optimistic guesses and it promises a crowded galaxy. Feed it grim ones and it promises a lonely one. And for decades that was all it seemed to do. What changed is that reality came in and fixed the early terms, and fixing them did not relax the problem. It tightened it. The more ordinary we learnt planets and suitable worlds to be, the harder the silence became to explain by anything other than a wall somewhere down the line. The honest measurements made the mystery worse, not better, which is usually a sign you are looking at something real. There is a family of answers that locates the brutal step early, and it goes by the idea that worlds like ours are far less ordinary than they look. Perhaps a planet needs a large moon to steady its spin, or a giant neighbour to sweep away the worst of the bombardment, or a churning interior that keeps the surface from going dead, and perhaps the combination is rare. Each of these would push one of the early fractions down without our noticing, because from the inside a winning ticket always looks normal. We cannot yet tell whether Earth is a common kind of world or a strange one, and that uncertainty sits right on top of the steps that would most reassure us if they were the wall. The factor that frightens me most in the chain is the last one, the longevity, because it is the one we are actively testing with our own existence. A civilization only counts as detectable while it lasts, and our own technological age is only about a century old, a flicker against the age of our planet. We do not know whether technological civilizations typically endure for millions of years or burn out in a few centuries. And the difference between those two is the difference between a galaxy that should be full of long-lived voices and one that is full of brief flares no one was listening for at the right moment. We are, right now, one of those flares, and we have no idea yet how long ours will burn. The possibility that intelligence itself is the rare step is one I cannot rule out, and it is stranger than it first sounds. Life has existed on Earth for billions of years, and for almost all of that time nothing on the planet was building anything or asking any questions. Complex life filled the oceans and then the land for hundreds of millions of years without producing a single technological civilization. By that measure, intelligence of the kind that builds radios and rockets is not the natural summit of evolution at all. It is a recent and singular accident, one that the long history of life on our own world suggests is anything but inevitable. If that accident is the wall, it is behind us, and the rarity of minds like ours is the whole answer to the silence. The single data point problem is worth sitting with longer, because it is the quiet flaw under every confident claim in this subject, in both directions. We have exactly one example of a living world, one example of complex life, one example of intelligence, one example of a technological civilization, and that example is us. You cannot build trustworthy odds out of a sample of one. We do not know if Earth is typical or freakish, if life is common or a singular fluke, if our path was the easy road or an absurd stroke of luck. Every estimate in this field, the hopeful and the grim alike, is reaching beyond its evidence, and the honest move is to say so plainly and to weight our conclusions accordingly, lightly, ready to be wrong. Look at how much had to go right for our own world to stay habitable long enough, and you start to see where early walls could hide. The Earth has a churning core that generates a magnetic field, and that field deflects the stream of charged particles from the sun that would otherwise strip the air and water away over time. It has a crust broken into moving plates, which recycle carbon and stabilize the climate across hundreds of millions of years. It has a large moon that steadies the tilt of its spin, keeping the seasons from lurching wildly. Remove any of those and the story might have ended early, the world going dry or frozen or wildly unstable before anything complex could take hold. We do not know how often a world gets all of them at once. The factor I trust least and fear most remains the length of time a technological civilization endures, because it is the one we are actively writing the answer to. Our own technological age is about 100 years old. The planet beneath it is more than 4 billion years old. If you compress the history of the Earth into a single day, our entire technological existence is the last fraction of the final second before midnight. We do not know whether civilizations like ours typically stretch that final second into something long and luminous, or whether they tend to gutter out almost as soon as they begin. The whole question of whether the galaxy should be full of voices turns on that unknown, and we are at this moment the only experiment running that might one day answer it. There is a reading of our own origin that cuts toward the frightening side, and honesty requires putting it next to the hopeful ones. Life appeared on Earth remarkably early, almost as soon as the young planet had cooled enough to hold liquid water. If life starts that readily, that quickly, the moment conditions allow, then the beginning of life is probably not the rare step, not the wall. And if the first and most basic step is easy, then the wall is somewhere later, which is the direction we least want it to be. The very speed with which our own world came alive is, read this way, a small piece of evidence that the hard part was not getting started, and that whatever the hard part is, it may still lie ahead of us. The honest summary of the chain is that we have made the two ends meet in the middle, and the middle does not balance. The front of the chain is now well measured and generous, planets everywhere, suitable worlds in the billions. The far end is observed and empty, no detectable civilizations anywhere we have looked. Between a generous beginning and an empty end, the law of multiplication is merciless. Something in the middle has to be vanishingly small, and the only question the chain leaves open is which link it is, and whether that link is one we have already passed or one we are still walking toward. The structure is certain, even though the location of the small link is not. Still, the structure survives the uncertainty. Whatever the individual numbers turn out to be, the silence forces their product towards zero, and a product of large early terms can only be dragged to zero by a brutally small later one. The silence does not tell us which step is the killer. It tells us, with a kind of cold certainty, that one of them must be, and that near impossible step, the one the whole argument has been circling, has a name. It is the most disturbing idea in this entire subject, and once you understand it, the silence never sounds the same again. Read the chain one more time, but this time read it as a gauntlet rather than a ladder. A ladder you climb steadily, rung by rung, given time. A gauntlet is something you run while it tries to stop you, and most who enter it do not come out the far side. To get from a lifeless world to a civilization that spreads across the galaxy, a planet has to pass every step in order, with no skips. It has to be the right kind of world to begin with. Life has to start on it at all. That life has to build itself into complex cells. Those cells have to assemble into many-celled creatures. Those creatures have to develop intelligence. That intelligence has to produce technology. And the technological civilization has to survive long enough to reach out and spread. Now lay the silence over that gauntlet. Billions of worlds have run it, across billions of years, and the galaxy in front of us is empty of any civilization that finished. Which means the chance of running the whole thing, start to finish, is not merely low, it is almost zero. Because billions of attempts have produced, as far as we can see, nothing that spread. And a product of probabilities only comes out at almost zero if at least one of the steps in it is itself almost impossible. So somewhere along that gauntlet there is a step that almost nothing passes, a wall that takes billions of beginnings and lets essentially none of them through. That wall is what the argument calls the Great Filter. The phrase comes from an economist who laid the logic out cleanly, and the power of it is that it does not care which step the wall is. It only insists that there must be one, somewhere, strong enough to reduce a galaxy of billions of stars to a silence this complete. It might be a single near impassable barrier. It might be several merely difficult steps stacked together until the combined odds are crushing. Either way, the filter is real because the silence is real, and the silence is what a powerful filter would produce. And once you accept that a filter exists, the single most important question about our own future falls out of it immediately, sharp enough to cut. Is the wall behind us in a step we have already somehow passed? Or is it ahead of us in a step we have not reached yet? Everything hangs on that, more than on almost any other question I know how to ask. Because we are running the gauntlet right now. We have passed many steps already, and we have not yet reached the end. So the wall is either in our past, cleared, or in our future, waiting. I will be honest that there is real disagreement about every part of this. We do not know which step is the filter. We do not even know for certain that there is a single great one, rather than a long run of ordinary bad luck. And the whole frame rests on the assumption that advanced life expands and becomes visible, which might simply be wrong, a point I take seriously and will come back to. None of these doubts dissolve the core though. The silence is consistent with a wall, and a wall is the most natural thing that would make a silence like this. It is worth pausing on how unusual this kind of inference is, because it is doing real work and it is easy to distrust. We are reasoning from a single fact, the silence, to a sweeping claim about the history of billions of worlds we have never seen. That should make anyone cautious, but it is the same kind of reasoning that lets you walk into a quiet that should be noisy and know that something is wrong before you can say what. A galaxy this old, this full of suitable worlds, has a sound it should be making, and the absence of that sound is information, even if it does not yet tell us its cause. And the filter, whatever it is indifferent to our comfort, which is part of what makes it hard to think about clearly. It is not a villain and not a test. If it is an early step, it was a matter of chemistry and chance on a young world, caring nothing for the civilizations that would never exist because of it. If it is a late step, it is presumably some consequence of how technological civilizations tend to develop, equally blind, equally without malice. The silence is not cruel. It is just a fact with enormous weight, and the wall behind it, wherever it stands, is a feature of how reality is built, not a judgment passed on anyone. The evolutionary record on our own world hints at where some of these walls might stand, though it cannot prove it. Life appeared on Earth almost as soon as the planet could hold it, which some read as a sign that starting life is easy. But the step from simple cells to the complex kind that built everything larger took billions of years longer, and as far as the fossil record shows, it happened only once, a single merging of one cell into another that never repeated independently. A step that took that long and happened that rarely is exactly the sort of thing a great filter could be made of. We do not know that it is the wall, but it is the kind of near miss that shows how a wall could hide inside a history that from the inside looks like steady progress. There is a subtle point that makes the filter even harder to escape, and it concerns the other galaxies. It would not be enough to explain why our own galaxy is quiet. The night holds 100 billion other galaxies, many of them older than ours, and a civilization that arose in any one of them and learned to spread between the stars could, given the immense ages available, have begun spreading between galaxies as well. So the silence we have to explain is not local, it is the absence of any expanding presence reaching us from anywhere in the visible universe across all of cosmic time, and a filter strong enough to account for that has to be strong indeed, operating not on one galaxy but on all of them at once. The economist who framed this added a warning that is easy to underrate, which is that finding a hard step is not the same as finding the filter. The steps have to be not merely hard, but hard enough improbable to a degree that multiplies out to the near total silence we observe. It is not enough to point at the origin of life and say, "There, that is difficult." You have to show it is difficult enough that across billions of worlds and billions of years, it almost never succeeds, and then account for everything else in the chain on top of that. The filter is not satisfied by one impressive bottleneck. It demands a level of improbability so severe that the entire visible universe could try and fail, and that is a very high bar for any single step to clear. The gauntlet has a feature that makes it crueler than a simple list, which is that the steps must be passed in order and none can be skipped. A world cannot evolve intelligence before it evolves complex life, cannot build technology before it evolves minds, cannot spread before it builds the means. So the probabilities do not just multiply, they multiply along a single unbranching path. And a path with even one near impassable point on it is blocked no matter how easy every other point may be. That is why a single sufficiently improbable step is enough to produce the whole silence on its own, and why the search for the filter is really a search for the one place on the path where almost everyone stops, whether that place is early and behind us or late and ahead. The whole frame rests on one assumption I keep flagging because it genuinely could be wrong, which is that advanced life expands and makes itself visible. Maybe it does not. Maybe the drive to spread is a feature of our particular kind of restless biology and not a universal trait of intelligence. Maybe mature civilizations tend to grow quiet and small and efficient, leaving almost no trace, not because something kills them, but because spreading across the stars is simply not what minds eventually want. If that is true, the silence needs no filter at all, and the whole frightening structure relaxes. I cannot rule it out, but notice that it has the same demanding shape as every other gentle answer, requiring near every civilization to make the same choice, with no loud exception anywhere, and exceptions are exactly what the silence forbids. Remember that the silence is not only our galaxy's silence, because that widening makes the filter's job harder still. The night sky holds 100 billion other galaxies within reach of our instruments, a great many of them older than the Milky Way, each one a wheel of hundreds of billions of stars, with all the time in the world. A civilization arising in any of them at any point across cosmic history that learnt to spread between the stars and then between the galaxies could in principle have sent some sign sweeping toward us across the ages. We see no such sign from anywhere, in any direction, at any distance. The quiet is not a local quirk of our corner. It is the condition of everything we can see, which is a far larger thing to explain. The demand that the filter be improbable enough is stricter than it first sounds, and it closes off the comfortable middle. Suppose life arises only once in an entire galaxy, a genuinely rare event. That sounds like it might explain the silence, until you remember the 100 billion other galaxies, each presumably getting its one shot at life, and any one of those single successes able, over cosmic time, to spread and be seen. So even life being rare on the scale of a whole galaxy is not enough on its own. The filter has to be far more severe than that. Severe enough that across the entire visible universe, with its uncountable worlds and its billions of years, the number that break out and fill the sky comes to essentially zero. That is the size of the thing the silence demands. So the filter, whatever it is, has to be enormous, far larger than any single difficult step we can comfortably point to, and that is the thought that should stay with you from this part. It is not satisfied by life being hard to start, or intelligence being rare, or technology being dangerous taken alone. It demands that the whole chain, multiplied out across the entire visible universe and the whole of cosmic time, come to almost nothing. A wall that large is either a single step of breathtaking improbability hidden somewhere in our past, or a barrier of equal severity waiting in our future, and the silence by itself simply cannot tell us which of those enormous things it is. The silence says there is a wall. It does not say where the wall is, and where that wall sits decides everything about us because of a single piece of logic. simple enough to state in a sentence, that quietly turns every hopeful discovery we could ever make into a bad omen. Here is the fork, and it is worth slowing down for, because almost everything that matters runs through it. If the great filter is behind us, then the near impossible step is one we have already cleared. Maybe it was the start of life itself, the leap from dead chemistry to something that copies itself, which may be far harder than it sounds and may almost never happen even on a perfect world. Maybe it was the jump from simple cells to complex ones, a transition that on Earth took billions of years and happened, as far as we can tell, exactly once. Maybe it was intelligence. If the wall is one of those behind us, then we are one of the almost none that made it through, rare beyond easy belief, and the future could be genuinely open. But now take the other branch. Suppose those early steps are not the wall. Suppose life starts readily, complexity follows, intelligence is a common enough outcome of evolution given time. Then the wall is not behind us at all. It is somewhere ahead, in a step we have not yet reached, and we are walking toward it the way everyone before us did. And here is the part that should stop you cold. We have no reason to believe we are special. We are not the chosen exception in any of the math. We are a sample of one, doing the ordinary things a young civilization does. If a wall reliably stops civilizations at some stage we have not hit yet, then the honest expectation is that it stops us too. Now the cruel turn, the one that gives this whole subject its weight. Every time we find life somewhere other than Earth, we learn that one of the early steps is easier than it might have been. A microbe on another world tells us life starting is not the wall. Complex life on another world tells us complexity is not the wall. And each thing we rule out of the past pushes the wall forward, toward the steps we have not reached, toward the future, toward us. So the discoveries that everyone treats as hopeful, the ones we celebrate, are evidence in the wrong direction. They do not say we have company. They say the filter is probably still ahead. Follow that to where it actually goes. A single dead microbe found in the soil of another world would not be cause for celebration. It would be bad news because it would mean life is easy and the wall is later. And the ruin of a dead civilization, the remains of intelligent life that rose on another world and then ended, would be the worst news in human history. It would mean that intelligence is not the wall either, that the thing which stops everyone comes after the point we have already reached, and that it is sitting out there in our near future with a perfect record. We would be looking at our own most likely fate, written on someone else's world. I keep returning to how completely this inverts the thing we were taught to want. The hopeful version of space, the one most of us grew up on, treats a signal from another world as the best news imaginable, proof that we are not alone, that the universe is fertile and friendly and full. The filter takes that exact moment, the discovery we have spent generations hoping for, and recasts it as the worst thing we could learn. Not because the life itself is dangerous, but because of what its existence would imply about the road still in front of us. The dream and the nightmare turn out to be the same event, seen from two sides of a wall whose location we do not know. It is a strange grief to carry, the sense that the kindest universe is the emptiest one. Everything in us reaches for company, for the comfort of not being the only ones. And this argument asks us to hope for exactly the opposite, to root for dead worlds and barren oceans and a sky that stays silent. I do not think you can fully make peace with that. I have not. But I think you can understand why the hope inverts, and understanding it is its own kind of clarity, even when the clarity is bleak. The reason the argument bites so hard is a quiet fact about who gets to ask the question. Only a civilization that made it through every step so far is around to wonder about the filter at all. We could not find ourselves on the losing side of an early wall, because if we had hit it, we would not exist to notice. So the mere fact that we are here, asking, tells us nothing comforting about how easy the early steps were. It only tells us we are among the survivors of however hard they were, which is exactly what a survivor of a rare success and a survivor merely waiting for a later wall would both say. Our own existence cannot reassure us, because both stories produce observers exactly like us. Make the stakes concrete and close, because they are closer than the abstraction suggests. Within our own solar system, there are a few places where life might have started on its own. There is Mars, cold and dry now, but warm and wet in its youth. There is the buried ocean under the ice of Jupiter's moon Europa, and another under the ice of Saturn's moon Enceladus. Dark seas of liquid water kept warm by the squeeze of their giant planets. We are building machines to go and look in these places, and we will look within our lifetimes. The argument says that the result we should hope for is the disappointing one. We should hope those seas are sterile, that Mars never woke, that we drill and sample and scan and find nothing living and nothing that ever lived. One philosopher put the discovery in the bluntest possible terms, saying that finding the fossil of complex life on another world would be among the worst news humanity could ever receive, and the logic behind that grim line is exactly the one we have been tracing. A microbe would be bad, a complex creature, something that had climbed past the hard early steps, would be worse because it would rule out more of the early walls and push the filter further toward our own doorstep. The further up the ladder of complexity the dead thing had climbed before something stopped it, the more certain we could be that the same something is still ahead of us and that we have not yet reached the rung where it waits. I want to be careful not to let the grief curdle into something performed, because the inversion is genuinely strange to live with and does not need exaggerating. For as long as people have looked up, the wish has been for company, for a signal, for the end of the suspicion that we are alone. This argument asks us to invert that wish, not because company would be dangerous in itself, but because of what its existence would reveal about the road ahead. It is a quiet, reasoned kind of dread, not a scream, and the right response to it is not panic, but a sober recalibration of what we are actually hoping for when we send our machines out to look. We are hoping, if this is right, to be disappointed. The observer selection point is worth stating one more way, because it is the hinge the whole spike turns on. Think of someone who has won an improbable lottery. From the inside, holding the winning ticket, they cannot work out how unlikely the win was, because they are guaranteed to be a winner if they are around to think about it at all. The losers are not there to wonder. We are in that position with respect to the whole chain of steps behind us. We are necessarily winners of every step so far, which means our being here tells us we passed them and tells us nothing about how hard they were to pass. The early steps could have been easy or nearly impossible, and either way, the only ones left to ask the question are the ones who made it through. There is a single day waiting somewhere in our future if the searches ever succeed, and the strangeness of that day is hard to overstate. It would be announced as triumph, the greatest discovery ever made, the end of the oldest loneliness, life beyond the earth confirmed at last. People would weep with the wonder of it. And underneath the celebration, for anyone who had followed this argument to its end, there would be a colder current, the knowledge that the wall had just moved closer, that the silence had given up a secret, and the secret was the wrong one. The triumph and the dread would arrive in the same announcement, inseparable, and we would have to feel both at once, and I do not think any of us is truly prepared for that particular doubleness. What makes the discovery of a dead civilization the worst case is that we would be, in a real sense, reading our own likely obituary in advance. To find the ruins of intelligent life on another world would be to find a civilization that climbed the same gauntlet we are climbing, passed the same early steps, reached roughly the stage we have reached, and then stopped, ended by something. And since we have no reason to think we are special, the most natural conclusion would be that the same something waits for us, that we are looking at a preview of our own ending written on another world. A microbe would be bad news about the steps behind us. A ruin would be bad news about the steps ahead, which is the only kind of bad news that actually threatens our future. I keep being struck by how the spike reverses the meaning of every word we use about the search. Discovery, the most hopeful word we have for it, becomes a warning. Company, the thing we have always wanted, becomes a threat to our future, rather than a comfort in our present. Even life, the word for the thing we are looking for, becomes in this reading the carrier of the worst news we could get. None of that is because life elsewhere would harm us directly. It is because of what its existence would reveal about the shape of the gauntlet we are still running. And the revelation runs exactly opposite to the hope that sent us looking in the first place. So the rational hope inverts completely. And this is the sentence I find hardest to say plainly. We should hope the universe is sterile. We should hope that every world we ever reach is dead, that Mars is barren, that the buried oceans are empty, that we go out looking and find nothing but rock and chemistry all the way down. Because in this reading, an empty universe is the only kind that leaves our future open. The full one, the one we always dreamed of, the one with company in it, is the one where the wall is still in front of all of us, ours simply not yet arrived. That is the turn, and it is the heaviest one in this whole subject. We have just reached the hardest turn in this whole subject, the point where hoping to find life becomes hoping to find a graveyard. So hold one question from here, because everything after it depends on the answer. If there is a filter, is it behind us, already past, or is it still ahead, still waiting? One of those means we are rare and the future is open. The other means we are ordinary, and ordinary things in this story do not last. I will come back to which way the evidence leans, and you are not going to like the shape of the answer. If the wall is ahead of us, the first honest question is what it could possibly be. The usual answers come quickly, because we can already see candidates in our own short history. Weapons capable of ending a species, held by the same civilization clever enough to build them, engineered plagues, biology turned into a tool that can turn back on its makers, a technology that slips its leash and pursues its own ends, or something slower and duller, a civilization that grows until it strips its world bare and collapses before it ever leaves home. Any of these could end a civilization, and that is not in doubt. We have stood close enough to some of them to feel the heat, but a great filter has a far harder job than ending a civilization here and there. To explain the silence, it has to end nearly all of them. Think about what that requires. Across the whole galaxy, across billions of years, on worlds with different chemistries and different histories and different kinds of minds, the same barrier would have to catch essentially everyone. And the reason it has to be nearly perfect is a matter of simple arithmetic. If a filter lets even one civilization in 1,000 slip past, that survivor expands, and a single expanding civilization is exactly the loud, galaxy-filling presence we already established is not there. 1 in 100 getting through is not enough. The one that gets through fills the sky. So a filter ahead would have to be something close to universal. A fate that finds civilizations, no matter how different they are, no matter how carefully some of them try to avoid it. And when you hold the candidates up against that standard, they start to look insufficient. Self-destruction by weapons might claim many civilizations, but surely not every one. Not the cautious ones, not the ones that learn. Resource collapse might end others, but not those that solve it. For a danger to be the great filter, it cannot be the kind of thing that wise or lucky civilizations escape. It has to get all of them, and we do not actually know of anything that fits that description. That last point is a real thread of hope, and I want to give it its due rather than rush past it, because the honest treatment of this argument has to include the places where it strains. The fact that no obvious danger would reliably get absolutely everyone is a genuine problem for the idea that the wall is ahead. It suggests maybe that the wall is more likely behind us after all, in some early step so improbable that we simply got lucky, and that the future is not guarded by a perfect killer because no such perfect killer exists. I do not know that this is right, but it is the most reassuring, honest thought in the whole subject, and it deserves to be said as plainly as the frightening ones. Before we move on from the idea of a wall ahead, it is worth being precise about why almost perfect is such a demanding standard, because the demand is what gives the hope its footing. A danger that kills half of all civilizations is, from the point of view of the silence, almost no danger at all. The surviving half would still fill the galaxy many times over, and we would see them, even a danger that spares one civilization in 1,000 leaves, more than enough survivors to light up the sky. For a filter ahead to produce the silence we actually observe, it has to approach a clean sweep, sparing essentially no one, and that is a far rarer kind of thing than a danger that is merely terrible. Whether that is a comfort depends on a question I genuinely cannot answer, which is how much credit to give our own ingenuity at avoiding fates we can see coming. We are, after all, the kind of creature that can name its own dangers in advance, argue about them, and sometimes step around them. If that capacity is common among technological civilizations, then a filter ahead is hard to believe in, because foresight would let at least a few slip past. If that capacity is weaker or rarer than we flatter ourselves it is, then the comfort thins. I lean toward thinking the difficulty of naming a perfect killer is real and meaningful. But I hold it loosely, because the stakes are too high to hold it any other way. Walk the candidates up against the near-perfect standard one at a time, and watch them strain. A civilization that learns to end itself with weapons might do so, but surely somewhere, across billions of worlds, would learn restraint, and restraint is all it takes for one to slip through. A civilization that builds a technology it cannot control might fall to it, but not every civilization would build the same reckless thing, and the careful ones would survive to spread. Every specific danger we can name has the same flaw from the filter's point of view, which is that it is escapable, and a wall that can be escaped is not a wall at all. The filter ahead needs something inescapable, and inescapable is a much taller order than merely deadly, and there is a possibility under the filter ahead reading that is worse than any of the named dangers, which is that the wall is something we cannot yet conceive of at all. Every candidate we can list, the weapons, the plagues, the runaway machines, comes from our own brief and limited experience of being technological. A civilization a step or two beyond us might face a hazard that does not appear until you reach a stage we have not reached. A hazard as invisible to us now as our own dangers would have been to the first creatures that crawled onto land. If the wall is of that kind, then our inability to name it is not evidence of its absence. It is exactly what we would expect to feel, standing on the near side of something we have not yet come close enough to see. It is worth taking the slow filter seriously alongside the violent ones, because not every wall has to be an explosion. A civilization might simply turn inward, growing comfortable, ceasing to expand, losing the will or the reason to spread, until it quietly fades without ever filling the sky. If that is common enough, it could account for the silence without any catastrophe at all, just a universal tendency for civilizations to settle and stop. It is gentler than self-destruction, but from the outside it produces the same quiet, and it has the same demanding requirement that it claim essentially everyone, with no restless exception that keeps pushing outward. Whether a soft fade can be that universal is as open a question as whether a hard catastrophe can be. The thread of hope in this section is real enough to hold on to, so let me state it as its own claim rather than a footnote. The very difficulty of naming a danger that would reliably end every civilization, careful and careless alike, is evidence, weak but real, that the wall is more likely behind us than ahead. If no plausible future hazard can be that thorough, then the silence is better explained by an improbable step already in our past, some early bottleneck we were lucky enough to clear. That would mean we are rare, and that the open future the optimists always assumed is actually the better supported reading. I do not think the matter is settled, but the failure to find a perfect killer is a point on the hopeful side of the ledger, and an honest accounting has to enter it there. Take the most discussed modern candidate, a machine intelligence that outgrows its makers and pursues its own ends, and hold it up to the standard the filter demands. It is easy to see how such a thing could end the civilization that built it. It is much harder to see how it ends the silence, because a machine intelligence that replaced its makers would still be a presence, still need energy, still in all likelihood expand and grow visible in exactly the ways we searched for. A successor that wipes out its creators and then fills the galaxy itself does not produce a quiet sky. It produces a loud one with different occupants. For the runaway machine to be the great filter, it would have to destroy its makers and then, somehow, also stay silent and small forever, and that is a far more specific and less obvious outcome. The gentlest version of a filter ahead is not a catastrophe but a ceiling, the possibility that civilizations reliably reach a certain stage and simply stop, not destroyed but settled, turning their attention inward and never again reaching out. There is no fire in this version, no extinction, just a quiet, universal contentment that ends expansion before it fills the sky. From the outside it would look exactly like death, the same absence, the same silence, but from the inside it would feel like peace. I find it the hardest candidate to argue with, because it asks for no violence and no perfect killer, only a tendency for mature minds to lose the restlessness that drove them outward. Whether minds reliably do that, across every kind of civilization, is something we have exactly no way to know. The cruelest feature of a true filter ahead is that it would have to catch even the civilizations that saw it coming, and that recursion is what makes it so hard to credit and so hard to dismiss. We can name our dangers, we can argue about them, prepare for them, sometimes avoid them. For a wall to be the great filter, it would have to defeat not only the careless civilizations, but the careful ones, not only those blind to the danger, but those who named it in advance and bent every effort to escape, the way we are trying to do now. A danger that thorough, that it gets even the ones who see it, is either something we have not imagined, or something about the predicament itself that no amount of foresight escapes. I do not know which would be worse to learn. If I had to name the single most reassuring fact in this whole subject, it would be this difficulty of imagining a perfect killer. Every danger we can describe is escapable by someone, somewhere. Given foresight and luck, and escapable dangers do not make great filters. That does not prove the wall is behind us, but it tilts the honest weight in that direction, toward the reading where the hard step was early and improbable and already cleared, and the future is correspondingly open. I hold that tilt gently, because the stakes forbid overconfidence in either direction. But when people assume the filter ahead is the default, the most likely reading, I think they are skipping past the real and stubborn problem that no one can say what such a filter would actually be. A wall ahead would have to be almost perfect to explain a silence this complete, and we cannot name the thing that would be. That is either a comfort or a warning, depending on how much you trust our imagination to have caught up with the dangers. But there is another way to read a silence this complete, one that does not need a wall of death at all. What if the galaxy is not empty, but full and quiet on purpose? Start from a few cold assumptions and see where they lead, because this reading is built entirely out of logic rather than observation. Assume that for any civilization, survival comes first, ahead of curiosity, ahead of friendliness. Assume that resources in the end are finite, so that civilizations are at some level in competition for the same matter and energy. And assume the hardest thing of all, that you can never truly know the intentions of another civilization across the immense gulfs of distance and time that separate the stars. A message takes years or centuries to cross. By the time you hear a greeting, the senders may be long changed or long gone, and a civilization that was harmless when it spoke may be something else entirely by the time you reply. Add one more fact about technology, which is that it can leap. A civilization only slightly ahead of another can, in a short time, become vastly more powerful, the way a small lead in a fast-moving field becomes an unbridgeable one. So if you detect another civilization, you face a problem with no safe answer. You cannot verify that they are friendly. You cannot guarantee they will stay that way. And you cannot be sure that revealing yourself by answering will not simply tell a future enemy exactly where you live. Under those rules, the coldly rational move is not to reach out. It is to stay hidden and to treat any civilization you do detect as a potential threat to be watched, or worse. That is the reasoning behind what gets called the dark forest, an old idea given its sharpest form by a science fiction writer who imagined the galaxy as a wood at night, every civilization a hunter moving in silence, because to make a sound is to invite a shot from the dark. In that reading, the silence is not a graveyard at all. It is discipline. The galaxy could be full of life, and quiet precisely because the ones who broadcast did not survive to keep broadcasting, and the ones who survived learned to say nothing. The quiet would not be absence, it would be a held breath, repeated across millions of worlds. And if that is true, then we have already made the mistake. For about a century, the Earth has been leaking radio into space, the spillover of our broadcasts spreading outward at the speed of light. That signal now fills a bubble roughly 100 light-years across, and it grows by 1 light-year every year, a widening announcement of our presence and our position. We did it without thinking, in the ordinary course of becoming technological. Some of the people who study this seriously argue that we should listen all we like but never deliberately answer, never aim a signal outward on purpose, because in a dark forest the one thing you do not do is call out. Now I have to be straight with you about what this section is and is not, because it is the most speculative ground in the whole subject. The Dark Forest is a story built from game theory and dressed in fiction, and it rests on assumptions that may simply be false. There is no evidence of predators out there, none, not a single confirmed hostile signal or destroyed world. Serious critics point out that it assumes a fixed and universal hostility, a galaxy where everyone reasons the same cold way and no one ever chooses trust or cooperation. And real civilizations might not be so uniform. It is a coherent and unsettling story. It is not a finding, and I will not present it as one. What unsettles me most about the Dark Forest is not the predators it imagines, but how little it needs to assume. The other dark readings lean on hard facts of biology or chemistry that might or might not hold. This one needs only motives we already understand. The wish to survive, the impossibility of trusting a stranger you cannot see, the knowledge that strength can change faster than intentions. Those are not alien ideas. They are the ideas, and the argument simply scales them up to the size of a galaxy and lets the cold logic run. That is what gives it its grip. It does not require the universe to be strange, it only requires it to be afraid. And yet the same featurelessness that makes it plausible is what keeps it from being knowledge. A story that follows from general assumptions about survival can be told about almost any silent sky, which means the silence does not actually confirm it. It fits, but a great many things fit. I find it valuable mostly as a warning about ourselves, a reason to think twice before we shout into a dark we do not understand, rather than as a settled account of why the dark is dark. We are very young at this, and the one civilization whose behavior we can observe, our own, has been broadcasting for a century without having thought the question through. That alone should make us humble about what the silent ones may or may not be doing. There is a chain of suspicion built into the Dark Forest that is worth following, because it is what makes hiding rational rather than merely fearful. It is not enough that you might trust a stranger. You have to worry about whether they trust you, and whether they think you trust them, and whether the safest move for them, uncertain of all that, is to remove the risk you represent before you can remove the risk they represent. Each side reasons the same way about the other, and the reasoning spirals down to a single grim flaw, which is that silence is safe and contact is a gamble with your existence as the stake. The argument does not require anyone to be evil, it only requires everyone to be careful, and to know that everyone else is careful too. The strongest case against the Dark Forest is not that it is impossible, but that it assumes too much sameness. It pictures every civilization arriving at the same cold conclusion, choosing silence and suspicion, with no one ever breaking ranks to cooperate or reach out. But the one civilization we can actually observe, our own, is full of voices arguing for openness as well as caution, and we have already broadcast for a century without having decided anything. If we are this divided and this careless, it is hard to believe every other civilization marched in lockstep to the same grim strategy. The dark forest may describe some of them. The claim that it describes all of them perfectly enough to silence an entire galaxy is the part that strains. The argument over whether to answer is not theoretical, and it has real heat to it among the people who do this work. The established practice has been to listen and to study any signal carefully before responding, rather than to broadcast deliberately and loudly at chosen stars. Some argue that this caution is wise, that in a universe whose dangers we do not understand, the prudent move is to gather information without advertising our position. Others argue that our radio leakage has already given us away, that the bubble of our broadcasts is decades wide and growing, and that the question of whether to reveal ourselves was quietly settled the moment we became loud without meaning to. Both sides are reasoning under total uncertainty, which is the only honest way to reason about it. It bears repeating that the dark forest came to most of us through a story, and that its origin in fiction is not a mark against it, but a reason for care. A powerful narrative can make an idea feel more established than it is, can lend the weight of vivid scenes to what is underneath a chain of assumptions about strangers we have never met. The underlying reasoning about survival and uncertainty and the danger of revealing yourself predates the story and has been taken seriously on its own terms. But the grip the idea has on the imagination owes a great deal to how well it was told, and I try to keep those two things separate, to weigh the logic without being swept along by the imagery the logic came wrapped in. The deliberate sending of signals, aiming a powerful beam at a chosen star in the hope of being heard, is the practice that worries the cautious most, precisely because it is intentional in a way our leakage is not. Our television and radar spilled outward by accident, a faint glow that fades into the noise of the galaxy at modest distances. A deliberate beam, focused and powerful and repeated, is a different act, a true announcement meant to be detected. The argument against doing it is that we cannot know who is listening or how they would respond, and that the decision to speak for the whole planet should not be made lightly by whoever happens to own a transmitter. The argument for it is that silence guarantees solitude, and that a civilization too frightened to ever speak has in some sense already given up. The deepest criticism of the dark forest is that cooperation exists, and that a picture of the galaxy in which it never does is a picture missing half of what we actually observe about intelligent behavior. Among the one species we can study, our own, the story is not only suspicion and preemption, it is also trade, alliance, treaty, the slow construction of trust between former enemies, the discovery again and again that cooperation can outperform conflict. If those tendencies are anywhere as common as the fearful ones, then the galaxy is not uniformly a forest of silent hunters, and the model that says it must be is leaving out the very behaviors that let a technological species survive its own dangers long enough to reach the stars at all. It is worth being concrete about our own bubble of noise, because it is the one piece of this we have actually created. For roughly a century, the Earth has been radiating the byproducts of its technology outward, the spill of broadcasts and radar and the general electrical hum of a waking civilization. That radiation travels at the speed of light, which means the leading edge of our earliest transmissions has now reached every star within about 100 light years of us. Hundreds of stars, some with worlds of their own. Anything living around those nearer stars that was listening could in principle already know we are here. We announced ourselves, without deciding to, in the ordinary course of becoming what we are, and there is no calling that announcement back. What the dark forest finally leaves me with is less a belief than a caution about ourselves. Whether or not the galaxy is a forest of silent hunters, we are a young civilization that became loud without ever deciding to, that has been announcing its position for a century while only beginning to ask whether that was wise. That alone is worth sitting with, not because I think the arrows are already on their way, but because it shows how little thought we have given to our own conduct in a situation whose rules we do not understand. The dark forest may be wrong about the galaxy. It is at least a useful mirror, showing us a species that acted first and reasoned afterward in a dark it has not begun to map. In this reading, the silence is not death, but caution, and we have been the ones making noise in a place where noise might not be safe. So which is it in the end? A wall that kills nearly everyone, a whole galaxy choosing to hide, or something gentler than either? We have 3 dark stories and a quiet sky. The honest next step is to ask what the silence, taken on its own, actually supports. Lay the live options side by side and look at them honestly, without deciding in advance which one you want to be true. The first is that we are early. The universe is still young, only 13 billion years into a life that will run for many trillions, and the small steady stars that will host life for the longest are barely getting started. On that reading, the galaxy is quiet not because the party ended, but because it has hardly begun, and we are among the first guests to arrive. That is not a doom at all. It is the possibility that the silence is simply the silence of being early. The second option is that the filter is behind us, that life or complexity or intelligence is genuinely rare, that we cleared the hard step long ago, and the quiet is the sound of how few ever do. The third is the one we have been circling, that the filter is ahead, and the quiet is the sound of civilizations reliably ending before they spread. The fourth is the dark forest, a galaxy full but hiding. And the fifth, never to be dismissed, is that we have simply not looked long enough or carefully enough, that the silence is an artifact of our crude and youthful searching, rather than a fact about the galaxy. Here is the plain and frustrating truth. The silence is consistent with every one of those readings. It does not, on its own, choose between them. The same empty sky that looks like doom under one reading looks like an early morning under another, and nothing we have yet measured tips the balance cleanly. Anyone who tells you the matter is settled, that we are certainly doomed, or certainly alone and safe, has run out ahead of the evidence and is selling you a feeling rather than a fact. We do not know. That is the accurate state of it, and it is uncomfortable, and it is where the honesty of this subject lives. But remember the cruelty we uncovered at the center of all this, because it does not go away just because the question is open. The one piece of evidence that would speak loudest, that would actually start to settle things, is the discovery of life beyond Earth. And that discovery is precisely the one that argues for the darkest of the readings. So we are in a position where the clearest signal we could possibly receive is the one we should most fear receiving. The road to an answer runs directly through the news we least want to hear. I want to dwell for a moment on the discomfort of not knowing, because the instinct in a subject like this is to escape it, to grab the doom or the reassurance and stop thinking. Both escapes are available, and both are false. The person who decides we are certainly doomed gets the relief of certainty and the dark glamour of a tragic answer, and pays for it by believing something the evidence does not support. The person who decides we are certainly fine gets a different relief and pays the same price. The honest position is the uncomfortable one, holding several live possibilities at once, none of them confirmed, and refusing to let the weight of the question push you off the narrow ground of what we actually know. And what we actually know is genuinely a lot, which is easy to lose sight of under the uncertainty. We know the galaxy is old and full of worlds. We know it should be loud and is quiet. We know that 100,000 galaxies showed no sign of civilizations harnessing their stars. We know the deciding evidence is double-edged. None of that is speculation. The speculation begins only when we ask what the silence means, and the discipline is to keep a clear line between the part we have measured and the part we are guessing at. The measured part is solid ground. The meaning is where we have to walk carefully and admit when we are walking in the dark. The early arrival reading deserves more than a passing mention, because it may be the most quietly hopeful thing in the whole subject. The longest-lived stars are not the bright ones like our sun, which burn fast and die in mere billions of years. They are the small, dim, red ones, which sip their fuel so slowly that they will go on shining for trillions of years, far longer than the universe has yet existed. If life tends to arise around stars like those, then almost all of the life the universe will ever hold has not been born yet, and we are not late to an empty hall but absurdly early to one that will fill over timescales we can barely write down. On that reading, the silence is not a grave, it is a dawn. I find it steadying to separate what would change the picture from what would not. More listening, by itself, mostly deepens the same null we already have, unless it finds something, in which case everything changes at once. Finding independent life nearby would shift real weight toward the filter being ahead. Finding, against all odds, a living signal from a peer civilization would overturn the darkest readings entirely and raise 100 new questions. And learning somehow that the early steps are genuinely rare, that life or complex cells almost never arise, would shift weight toward the comforting side. We are not stuck forever, we are stuck for now, holding a silence that has not yet been made to speak, and aware that the next word it says may not be kind. Voir, the option that we simply have not looked enough, is the least dramatic and possibly the most likely, and it deserves respect precisely because it is dull. Every other reading asks us to believe something sweeping about the nature of life or the fate of civilizations. This one asks only that we be humble about the youth and crudeness of our search. We have been looking with real instruments for a handful of decades across a sliver of the possibilities, with tools that improve every year. It would not be shocking if the answer were simply that the signal is out there and we have not yet built the means to hear it. That would not resolve the deeper question, but it is a standing reminder that the silence we are interpreting may be partly a silence of our own ears. Notice that the readings are not all equally comforting, and that the honest mind has to resist leaning toward the one it likes. The early arrival idea is gentle and may be true. The filter behind is reassuring and may be true. The filter ahead is frightening and may be true. The dark forest is unsettling and may be true. Wanting one of them to be the answer does nothing to make it the answer, and the discipline this subject demands is to hold all of them open in proportion to the evidence, which at the moment does not strongly favour any. That is a hard posture to maintain, because the questions are not abstract and the stakes press on us to choose. But choosing ahead of the evidence is exactly the error this whole way of thinking is meant to guard against. To grasp how little of the haystack we have searched, hold the dimensions of the problem honestly. A signal could come from any of a few 100 billion stars in our galaxy, at any of an enormous range of frequencies, at any time across millions of years, in any of several forms, pointed or leaking, constant or brief. The portion of that immense range we have examined with real sensitivity is so small that finding nothing in it is almost what you would expect, even if the galaxy were quietly humming with signals we simply have not tuned to. This is the great caution that sits under every grand interpretation. The nulls are real, but they are nulls in a tiny corner of a far larger space, and we should not mistake the corner for the whole. It is worth holding the line one more time between what we have measured and what we are guessing, because the whole honesty of the subject depends on keeping them apart. Measured, the galaxy is old, planets are common. The loud galaxies spanning civilizations we searched for are not in the 100,000 galaxies we checked. No confirmed signal has reached us in 60 years of listening. Guessed, what any of that means, whether the filter is real, whether it is behind or ahead, whether the silence is death or caution, or eeriness, or the limits of our own ears. The measured part is solid and will not change. The guessed part is where every theory lives, and where every theory, including the frightening one, has to admit that it is reaching past the evidence into the dark. The early arrival reading rests on a fact about time that is easy to state and hard to feel, which is that the universe is still in its infancy. It is about 13 billion years old, and the small steady stars that will shine the longest will go on burning for many trillions of years, a span so much longer than the current age of the universe that almost all of time still lies ahead. If life tends to come late, around those long-lived stars, then the universe has barely begun making it, and a quiet sky now is exactly what an early arrival would see, not the silence after a party, but the stillness before one. On this reading, we are not the last embers of a dead universe, but the first sparks of a young one. Hold all the readings in view at once, and the honest conclusion is almost dull in its plainness, which is that we are looking at a real silence whose cause we have not yet found. It might mean we are early, or rare, or doomed, or hidden among hiders, or simply not yet equipped to hear what is there. The evidence we have does not choose, and the evidence that would choose is, in its clearest form, the evidence we should most fear. That is not a satisfying place to end an inquiry, but it is the true one, and I would rather hand you the true uncertainty than a tidy answer that the sky does not actually support, which lets me resolve, as honestly as I can, the question I asked you to hold a while ago. Is the wall behind us or ahead? The truthful answer is that we cannot yet tell. The silence is real and it is total, but it points in more than one direction at once, and the deciding evidence is double-edged in the cruelest possible way. We may not learn which world we live in until we find the thing that tells us, and the thing that tells us clearly would be the worst thing we could find. The silence still says one thing for certain though. The loud, full galaxy we expected is not there. So if the filter ahead is only one option among several, you might fairly ask why it deserves the name of the most disturbing. The answer is that disturbing and likely are not the same thing, and the filter ahead earns the title on a different ground than probability. Look at the shape of the argument rather than its odds. We can get strong evidence that the wall is ahead of us. Every living thing we ever find beyond Earth, every microbe, every fossil, every ruin, pushes the filter forward and strengthens the case that the danger is in our future. That is a real channel by which the world could hand us evidence of doom, and it could do it within our lifetimes, with a single discovery on Mars or beneath an icy crust. Now ask about the other direction. What evidence could we get that the wall is safely behind us, that we are rare and free? And the unsettling answer is almost none. An empty sky is exactly what we already see, and an empty sky stays equally consistent with we are the rare survivor, and with we are next in line for the wall. Finding nothing does not reassure us, because finding nothing is the status quo, and the status quo is what generated the fear in the first place. So the argument is built so that it can be confirmed toward doom, and almost never confirmed towards safety. The bad news has a clear path to us. The good news has none. Set that asymmetry next to the other thing we keep returning to, that we have no reason to think we are special, no claim on being the exception, and you get a particular and nasty structure. A quiet threat sits underneath every hopeful headline about life beyond Earth, a threat that good news can strengthen and that almost nothing can lift. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply waits under the data, growing slightly more likely every time we find what we were hoping to find, and never growing less likely no matter what we see. That, more than any probability, is what makes it the most disturbing reading. It is the one that hope itself feeds. I want to keep this fair, because fairness is the whole point of doing it this way. Most disturbing is not most likely, and I am not telling you the filter is ahead. The early arrival reading is genuinely alive and may well be the truth. The universe really is young, and the long-lived stars really are just beginning. The filter behind us is alive too, and the strange difficulty of naming any danger that would get absolutely everyone is a real argument in its favour. The whole filter ahead picture leans on assumptions that we are typical, that life expands and becomes visible, and either of those could be wrong in a way that dissolves the fear entirely. There is a particular loneliness to being the kind of creature that can work all this out, and still cannot resolve it. We are clever enough to see the shape of the trap, to lay out the fork and the asymmetry and the cruel doubling of the bad news, and not clever enough, not yet, to learn which side of the wall we are on. We are like someone who has reasoned their way to the existence of a locked door, but has no key and cannot see what lies behind it. Only that what lies behind it decides everything. That gap between what we can deduce and what we can confirm is where this whole subject lives, and it may be a long time before anything closes it. And the part one keep turning over is that the closing of it, if it ever comes, will most likely arrive as bad news. The day we find the first independent life, the first cell that did not descend from our own beginning, will be celebrated everywhere as the greatest discovery in history. And it will also be, if this argument is right, the day the wall moved closer, the day the silence gave up one of its secrets, and the secret was not the one we wanted. I do not know how to hold those two things at once, the triumph and the dread. I only know that the argument says they are the same day, and that we should be prepared for the possibility that our greatest discovery and our worst news will arrive in the same breath. The unfalsifiable quality of the reassuring side is the part that should bother a careful person most. In most questions, you can name the evidence that would settle them either way, and the symmetry is what makes the inquiry feel fair. Here the symmetry is broken. Evidence for doom is gettable. A single discovery could deliver it. Evidence for safety is not, because the only thing that would prove the wall is behind us is an absence we already have and that already fails to reassure. An argument you can confirm but never refute is one to be wary of, and I am wary of this one for exactly that reason. But being wary of its structure does not let me dismiss its content, because the structure is a fact about our evidence, not a flaw in our reasoning. It matters to say clearly that I am not arguing for despair, because the asymmetry is an argument about evidence, not about fate. The fact that bad news is easier to confirm than good news does not make the bad news true. It makes it loud. A reasonable person can look at the same silence and conclude that we are most likely early, or most likely rare, and that the filter ahead is a real possibility worth taking seriously, rather than a verdict already delivered. The point of dwelling on the structure is not to convince you we are doomed. It is to show why this particular reading lodges in the mind and will not leave, and why it grows heavier with exactly the discoveries we are racing to make. What gives the reading its strange permanence is that it cannot be argued away by reassurance, only by evidence we may never get. You can tell someone afraid of the filter ahead that we are probably early, probably rare, probably fine, and you might even be right, but you cannot show it because the only proof would be a kind of evidence the silence does not provide. So the fear does not resolve, it sits. It becomes a permanent feature of looking up, a quiet possibility folded into every hopeful announcement, neither confirmed nor dispelled, waiting on a discovery that would only ever confirm it. That is an unusual thing for an idea to be, and it is why this one, once it lodges, tends to stay. There is a quiet image that captures the structure better than any argument, and it is the one I keep returning to. The fear does not stand in front of you where you can face it. It sits underneath, beneath every good thing the search might find, so that the better the news, the heavier it grows, and no amount of further quiet ever lightens it. A threat you could confront would be easier than this. This one cannot be confronted, only carried, because the evidence that would lift it does not exist, and the evidence that would deepen it is exactly what we are hoping to find. That is what I mean when I say this reading is the most disturbing. Not the likeliest, the one that the act of hoping cannot help but feed. The assumption that we are typical, that we can reason about all civilizations by treating ourselves as an average case, is the soft spot the whole filter ahead reading leans on, and it might simply be false. If we are unusual, early, or strange in some way we cannot detect from the inside, then the inference from our situation to everyone else's breaks, and the fear loses its footing. The trouble is that we have no way to check our own typicality, no second example to compare ourselves against, no outside vantage from which to see whether we are a representative sample or a peculiar one. So the assumption is doing heavy work while standing on nothing firmer than the absence of a reason to think otherwise, and that is worth remembering whenever the argument starts to feel like certainty. Set against all this structure, the simplest, honest summary of the most disturbing reading is that it is a fear hope cannot cure. With most fears, good news helps, evidence accumulates on the reassuring side, and the worry eases over time. This one runs backward. The good news, the discovery of life, strengthens it, and the absence of bad news fails to weaken it, so that nothing in the ordinary flow of evidence ever lets the worry rest. It is the rare kind of frightening idea that is built to outlast every reassurance you could offer it, not because it is certainly true, but because of the peculiar shape of the evidence that bears on it. That endurance, more than any estimate of odds, is the thing that earns it the name of the most disturbing. At the base of the whole frightening structure sits one premise, plain and hard to argue with, that we have no reason to think we are the exception. We are not the oldest civilization, or the wisest, or the most careful, so far as we can tell. We are simply the one we happen to be, a young technological species on an ordinary world around an ordinary star in an unremarkable part of an ordinary galaxy. Every instinct science has taught us says not to assume we are special, and that same instinct, applied here, says we should not assume we will beat odds that everyone before us apparently failed. The premise is humble, almost modest. It is also, in this context, the most chilling thing in the argument, because it is the step that turns the fate of the silent ones into a forecast of our own. The reason I have spent so long on a reading I do not even claim is the likeliest is that its shape is instructive, and the shape is the lesson. It shows how an argument can be perfectly logical and still trap you, how the structure of available evidence can make a fear permanent without making it certain, how good news and bad news can switch places once you understand what each would imply. Whether or not the filter is ahead, learning to think clearly about a question like this, to hold a real possibility seriously without surrendering to it, to keep the line between what is measured and what is feared, is worth the effort on its own. The silence is a hard teacher, and this is one of the harder things it has to teach. But the structure is what it is, and you cannot unsee it once you have seen it. The silence, read this way, is not just empty, it is a verdict we cannot yet read, written in a language where the only legible words are the ones we dread. It can be confirmed in the direction of our ending, and resists confirmation in the direction of our safety. And it grows quietly worse with exactly the discoveries we most want to make. Which leaves the question I find I cannot put down, the question of what a person is supposed to do with a silence like that, standing inside it, before the answer comes. Pull it all together and hold it at once. The galaxy is old enough and large enough that it should be full, and a full galaxy would be loud and obvious, and across every way we have learnt to look it is silent. That silence forces one factor in the long chain from dead matter to a spreading civilization to be brutally small, and the name for that brutal factor is the Great Filter. If the filter is behind us, the silence means we are among the almost none who made it through, rare and perhaps free to last a long time. If it is ahead of us, the same silence means we are ordinary, and ordinary things in this story end before they ever spread, and the readings refuse to collapse into one. A wall ahead would have to be nearly perfect, which is a real reason for hope since we cannot name a danger that flawless. Or the quiet could be a whole galaxy of civilizations holding still, each one hiding from the others in a dark it believes to be hunted. Or we could simply be early, the first faint stirrings in a universe that has trillions of years still to run. The data we have cannot yet choose between these, and the deciding evidence, the discovery of life elsewhere, is exactly the evidence that argues for the darkest of them. So this is where the argument actually leaves us, and I am not going to dress it up. We are living inside a silence that means either that we are a rare and precious success, or that we are the next ordinary failure, and the same emptiness fits both stories without strain. We cannot tell yet which one we are in. We are early to the answer, even though we are not early to the stakes, because the stakes are already fully real, whether or not we can read them. The one discovery that would speak clearly to us is the one we have the most reason to dread. Sit with the plain version of it for a moment, stripped of every reading. There is a sky above this world tonight, with a few 100 billion stars in our own galaxy alone, and beyond them 100 billion galaxies more. And across all of that, in every direction we have learnt to look, we have found no one, not a signal, not a structure, not a ruin, not a single cell that we can point to and say, there, that is someone else. Whatever the reason turns out to be, that is the fact underneath all the theories, and it is worth letting it be as strange as it actually is before rushing to explain it away. I do not think the right response to that fact is despair, and I do not think it is false cheer either. I think it is attention. We are, as far as we can presently tell, the only part of the universe that has woken up enough to ask why it is so quiet. And that may be a rare thing or a doomed thing or both. Either way, it is ours, this small lit clearing of awareness on one ordinary world, and the silence does not diminish it. If anything, the silence makes it stranger and more valuable, because it means that whatever we are, there may be very little else like it, and what little there is has not answered. I think the honest emotional posture, if there is one, is neither dread nor denial, but a kind of sober tenderness toward the fact of our own existence. Whatever the silence means, we are here, briefly, on a warm and living world, able to look up and reason about a galaxy that has so far shown us no one else. That may make us a rare success or a doomed commonplace, and we cannot yet tell which. But it does not change what we are while we are it, and it does not lessen the strangeness of being the part of the universe that noticed the quiet and tried to understand it. The silence asks a hard question of us. It does not get to answer the question of what we do with the time we have. There is a version of all this that is almost a responsibility rather than a fear. If we really are rare, if the early wall is behind us and lasting civilizations are scarce, then we are holding something the universe has produced almost nowhere else, and the question of whether we last becomes the most consequential question there is. And if the wall is ahead, then knowing it might be the one advantage we have that the silent ones did not, the chance to see a danger named in advance, and to be the rare civilization that steps around it. Either way, the argument does not end in helplessness. It ends in a sharpened sense of how much rides on what we do with the time between now and whenever the silence finally speaks. I keep coming back to the line from the cold open, the one that asked not where everyone is but what happened to them, and whether it is waiting to happen to us. That second clause is the whole weight of the subject in a single phrase. The silence might be telling us about the past, about how rare we are, about walls long cleared. Or it might be telling us about the future, about a wall we have not reached, about a fate the silent ones already met and we have not yet met only because our turn has not come. We cannot yet tell which tense the silence is written in, and the difference between those two tenses is the difference between a precious survival and a postponed ending. In the end, the silence does not hand us an answer, but it does hand us a question sharp enough to organize a life around, which is whether what we are is rare enough to be worth protecting at almost any cost. If the optimists are right and we are early, then we are among the first and have a long future to safeguard. If the rare Earth readings are right, we are precious and few. If the filter is ahead, then everything depends on being the exception, on seeing the wall and not walking into it the way the silent ones presumably did. Every one of those readings, the hopeful and the grim alike, points to the same practical conclusion, which is that the survival of this one lit world matters more than almost anything, because the universe has shown us no evidence that there is anything else like it nearby to take its place. What does it actually mean to live before the answer, knowing the answer exists and that we cannot yet read it? I think it means holding two facts at once without letting either crush the other. The first is that the question is real, and the stakes are total, that whether we are rare or doomed is not idle speculation, but the largest fact about our situation. The second is that we cannot resolve it now, and that arranging our lives around either the dread or the false comfort would be a mistake, because both run ahead of what we know. The honest posture is to keep looking, keep reasoning, keep the question open, and meanwhile to treat the one certain thing, this living world and our brief awareness on it, as the precious and possibly rare thing The silence suggests it might be, so I will end the thinking where the looking leaves us, which is inside an honest uncertainty rather than at a verdict. We do not know if we are alone, and we do not know if being alone is good news or the worst news there is, and we do not know whether the wall that the silence implies stands behind us, cleared, or ahead of us, waiting. What we know is that the sky is quiet, that it should not be, and that the quiet has a meaning we are not yet able to read. I would rather sit honestly in that uncertainty than pretend to a comfort or a doom I cannot support, because the uncertainty, faced squarely, is the truest thing this subject has to give, and it is heavy enough without anything added to it. And so the silence closes around the same fact it opened with, that the places which should be crowded are empty, and that the honest question is not only where everyone is, but what became of them, and whether it waits for us. We are a single lit clearing of awareness in a dark and quiet immensity, able to ask the question, unable yet to answer it, holding a piece of knowledge whose meaning could be that we are precious, almost beyond measure, or that we are simply next. Both readings fit the same quiet. I cannot tell you which is true. I can only tell you that the silence is real, that it has not been explained, and that we are, for now, the only ones we know of who are listening to it at all. The thing I want to leave you with is not the dread and not a denial of it, but the plain weight of being here to consider it at all. Somewhere in the long quiet of the universe, on one warm world, matter arranged itself into something that could look up and ask why the quiet is so complete, and that asking is, so far as we can tell, a rare and possibly singular event. The silence does not tell us whether it will last. It only tells us that it is, for now, ours, and that whatever the answer turns out to be, we are the ones who get to wonder, in the brief time we have, before the sky gives up its meaning. None of this changes what tonight is, a quiet sky over a living world, and us beneath it, awake. The argument does not tell us how to feel, and I have tried not to tell you either, because the honest thing is that the feeling has to be built out of an uncertainty rather than an answer. We are either rare or doomed or early or simply not yet able to hear, and the same silence holds all of those at once, and we go on living inside it regardless, looking up, asking, building the instruments that might one day make it speak. That is the situation plainly. Not soothing, not hopeless, just true, and ours to carry for as long as the looking takes. The science cannot tell you whether to feel chosen or condemned. I think that is important to say without flinching, because the temptation in a subject like this is to land on a comfort or a terror and call it the answer, and neither is honest. What the science can tell you is narrow and certain. The universe is silent. The silence has not been explained, and the most disturbing explanation for it is one that hope itself keeps feeding, and that we cannot rule out with anything we are currently able to see. That is the true shape of where we stand, and it is the silence named one last time that I want to leave you sitting inside. Here is what I keep coming back to. For most of my life, the dream was to find that we are not alone, that somewhere out there was a signal, a ruin, a single cell on another world, anything to break the silence. The great filter took that dream and turned it inside out, because if life starts easily, wherever it can, then the silence cannot be explained by life being rare. It has to be explained by life being stopped. Something would have to be reaching in, again and again across billions of worlds, and ending civilizations before they ever spread. And if that something is not behind us, in a lucky step we already passed, then it is in front of us, in a step we have not reached yet. We have no evidence that we are special. We are a young civilization on one ordinary world, doing the early things every civilization presumably does, and the silence says that almost none of them made it through this part. So I have come to hope for the thing I once would have dreaded. I hope Mars is dead. I hope the ice moons are sterile, and the nearest promising worlds are barren, and that every place we reach turns up nothing but rock and chemistry. Because in this argument, an empty universe is the only one that leaves the door open for us. A universe with life in it, especially life that got further than a microbe, is a universe where the wall is still ahead, and our turn to meet it has simply not come. We spent so long afraid of being alone. The silence may be telling us that alone was the best thing we could have been. If you stayed all the way out here in the quiet with me, a like or a subscribe helps the next one reach someone who would have wanted to come along. Sleep well.